All right, I see folks popping up. Welcome everyone. We're gonna wait just a couple of seconds for other folks to join and then we'll get started. So I'm gonna start with my introductions and then other folks can join as they're able to. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for tuning into this session, Keeping Up with the Joneses, How Neighbors Influence Shoreline Type. My name is Camille Marcotte, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the water and ecology educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Onondaga County. And I work as part of the Skaneateles Lake Education Program, which is funded by the city of Syracuse to provide education to help protect the water quality of Skaneateles Lake. I'm just going to go over some quick logistics and then I'll turn it over to our presenters for the evening. So this is the second program in our Shorelines Matter, an educational series about Skaneateles Lake shoreline protection and restoration. This series is a collaborative effort, and I want to thank the Skaneateles Lake Association and Go Native Perennials for their support and assistance. We will be wrapping up the series with one final program on July 13th, focused on naturalizing your shoreline. I'll share the link to register for that program in the chat, and that will be held in person in Skaneateles. We are using Zoom and webinar mode, so you're all muted right now just to reduce any background noise. But if you'd like to ask a question using your mic, you can click on the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen and I can unmute you at the end. We're going to hold off on any questions until the end, but feel free to type questions into the chat and Q&A sections throughout the webinar. If you use the Q&A function, you can ask questions anonymously too, if you prefer to do that, and I'll monitor both of those for when we get to the end. This program is being recorded and it will be available to watch on our YouTube channel. The link to the video will be shared in a follow-up email along with an evaluation and any resources. And I'll post the link to the program evaluation in the chat as well. Please take a few minutes to fill out that short evaluation. We really appreciate it. If you run into any technical issues throughout, please either email me and I'll put my email in the chat, or message me in the chat and I will do my best to help you troubleshoot. That's all from me though. I will now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Stephen Cyphers. Stephen is an associate professor in the School of Marine and Environmental Sciences and associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at the University of South Alabama. He is also a senior marine scientist too at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. His lab's research integrates ecology and sociology to understand and overcome major challenges facing coastal communities, including sustainable fisheries, coastal development, ecosystem restoration, and climate adaptation. Much of his previous and ongoing work focuses on living shorelines and nature-based strategies for coastal protection. Thank you so much, Stephen, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Camille, for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in this. It sounds like a really awesome series. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. So I will share my slides. And just to double check, how does it look fine?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you again. I'm Stephen Cyphers, and this photo that I kind of have as my cover slide here is my part of the world. I'm located down in Mobile, Alabama, which I'll show you on a map in a second, but is in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And as a kind of quick introduction to what my lab does in terms of research and also kind of what I'll talk about, is we focus on the way people interact with the environment, particularly along coastlines. And I really love this picture because it tells the story of a lot of what we're interested in. This is a picture in the Mobile Delta, standing on the back of a restaurant looking north into where 5 rivers come down into the system. And what you're looking at is Interstate 10 in the background that crosscuts the whole US, and the city of Mobile is off to your left. So there's a lot of urbanized pressures on the system here with the metro Mobile area, the interstate, and then there's a lot of port traffic of ships and recreational use. But what's really kind of surprising compared to a lot of areas where you see urbanization occur is if you look around the fringes of the picture, there's still a lot of grass in place. And so I really love this picture because it shows some balance between human desires, like the dock or the entrance to the restaurant, with the ecosystem still having some visible function in place, and keeping those shorelines important. Keeping those shorelines natural is pretty important to the health of coastal ecosystems and lakes and riverine and other systems. So that's kind of the gist of what we're interested in and the types of systems that we work in the most. So to orient you geographically for folks that aren't aware, with Alabama's very small but very productive coast in the northern Gulf of Mexico here, Mobile Bay is our primary feature. So I mentioned there's 5 rivers that come into it at the top up here around Mobile, and then it's a pretty classic estuary where there's a small opening to the open ocean. So you have fully fresh water coming down the rivers and then full ocean water, once you get outside the barrier islands. And what's been really rewarding, and one of the reasons I did my graduate school work here from 2007 to 2012, which is actually some of the work I'm going to show you. And then I spent 10 years in Boston at a university before just relocating back about a year ago. Is this system is really one where there's been a lot of investment and experimenting with living shorelines and nature-based strategies. And it's been a system where we've been able to experiment and learn a lot. And so I really love working in it. And so I'll show you kind of where our trajectory of work has gone, particularly on the social science side. But I will just make a plug to say, if you're interested in the environmental impacts of various shoreline types, there's a whole bunch of work that's been done in the system that I'm not going to talk about, that I'd be happy to share over email if anyone's interested. It's just been one of the systems that's had a lot of interest. And one of the reasons why is because we have still a lot of the things that we desire with residential development and other types of social or human uses of the system, but also a lot of remaining natural ecosystem. And so this is a pretty classic image of what we can find in parts of Mobile Bay. But I also could show you images like this from the Great Lakes, from smaller lakes, from Cape Cod in Massachusetts, North Carolina, and you wouldn't be able to tell where they were, because this pattern of growth along the coastlines is very, very common, to where as we build houses or residential lots into areas that were prior to that undeveloped, we typically take the shoreline, which is shown by this green line, and convert it into artificial structures, which is this red. Now I'll mention a little bit more on the context of why that matters in a second, but this is a pattern that we see throughout the United States and really, really globally. And so my group's been really interested in this as what we call a social ecological system. And so it's essentially a framework or lens for studying the way that people interact with the environment. So if we break this down to the specifics, it's essentially you have waterfront residents who make decisions on whether or not they want a vertical bulkhead, like the picture on the left, or whether or not they want to retain the marsh on the picture on the right. And these are decisions that we're able to see, and we're also able to try to understand what's driving it. But we know that these decisions, which shoreline type you have, has benefits and costs back for those waterfront residents, but it also scales to impact the health of our ecosystems and broader coastal communities. So if everyone chooses to install bulkheads, then we know that that accelerates erosion, usually leads to the washing away of natural habitats and declines water quality and fisheries and those types of things. So these can scale up to pretty large impacts depending on the way that the coastline is developed. And you can see this in a lot of different places. This is a pretty common image here where you see a stretch of shoreline to where the vertical walls or bulkheads were put in place and they accelerated erosion on the neighboring parcels. So essentially every lot here that has a house on it has put an artificial structure in place, and every lot that doesn't is left in the natural condition, and you can see that it's accelerated the erosion there. So this has been a big problem that people have been writing about for about 50 or 60 years now, but we're moving into a more exciting era of having other alternatives, which is what I'll focus on with living shorelines or nature-based strategies. But focusing first on this initial condition, one of the things that we were interested in coastal Alabama is what is driving this scenario of where you have some homeowners that decide to preserve the marsh along their shoreline or the natural condition, and you have others that choose to install these vertical walls. And so this was a study that we did while I was in graduate school back around 2010. And we delivered 1,000 surveys to waterfront residences around Mobile Bay and essentially asked a couple of questions. One, how do residents perceive and prioritize various attributes of shorelines? And we asked specifically about natural shorelines and then a couple of different types of artificial. And then we also tried to understand their decision-making, which I'll get to a little bit later. But the first, just showing you the overall picture of this perceptions and priorities across homeowners, it was a pretty important story that we were able to unravel. So we asked about 5 different criteria here that you can see across the top of each of these graphs, from effectiveness to durability to maintenance, environmental harm, and aesthetics. And for each of these, we asked about 3 shoreline types. So the red, in the over here that's circled in red is a vertical wall, which is shown as VW on the graphs. Purple is riprap revetment or rocks. We don't have naturally rocky shorelines down in the Southeast, so these are artificial. So that's RR for riprap. And then natural, which is shown as this green marsh. And the big kind of takeaway here is that the artificial shorelines of the vertical walls and the riprap revetments were perceived to be more effective and more durable from a homeowner's perspective. One of the things that was very surprising to us, if you jump down to aesthetics, is that most homeowners preferred the aesthetics or perceived the aesthetics of natural shorelines to be better. So it's not something that necessarily they wanted just because they liked their picket fences or straight lines along their shoreline, which was something we hypothesized going into it. It's actually that they prefer the look of the natural shoreline. Another, just to go ahead and spill a really important result that we found was the homeowners already perceived vertical walls and riprap revetments to be the most damaging, so to cause the most environmental harm. So in this case, it's telling you that you don't have to go with that type of an outreach messaging that the bulkheads are bad for seagrasses or bad for marshes. Most of the residents have seen that firsthand. So they're actually the experts in the system that already understand it. Maintenance is a complicated story that we've had to continue working on, but essentially this is one that residents really didn't know because they weren't sure. Many of them hadn't had the other shoreline type in a long period of time. But it does turn out that the artificial structures typically cost about twice as much to maintain. So this tells you quite a bit about what they perceive, but it doesn't really tell you what they prioritize. So we asked that as well. We asked them to rank these criteria of what they are prioritizing when making shoreline decisions. And it was very clear that cost effectiveness and durability were the top 3 that drive the day. I'll get into later some of these more lower ranked criteria, but just safe to say that these are the ones driving it. And these are the ones that they perceive bulkheads and riprap revetments to do better on. So this is why we tend to see a preference towards those within the system that we work in. But we also wanted to try to understand what drives their decision-making. So we know what they perceive and what they prioritize, but we were already anticipating that decisions would often be more complex than just these kind of simple criteria. So we asked another series of questions within the survey to where this is the results of what their shoreline currently is. So when you look at what homeowners currently have, we wanted to ask a bunch of other questions that might help us predict what shoreline they currently have. And so in the survey, we asked a bunch of other things, such as how long they've lived at their house, age, income, education, what they perceived to be the greatest value of their property, if they perceived it to be real estate value or environmental value, and then if they perceive the bay to be generally healthy. And then we asked a few other things geographically. But, and then, so after we did this, we used a statistical approach called classification tree modeling. And so I'll just explain this in kind of the big picture, which is why we use these. So classification trees essentially let you say, I want to know why people have certain shoreline types. And here's a whole bunch of things that I think might help predict or explain that. And so we put in all of these other survey questions as potential explainers of the patterns that we see. And when you do the tree modeling, essentially the higher up on a tree, the more important it is at explaining. And the lower you get down, the more conditional it is, among other things. So in this case, you can see that neighboring shoreline type is the most important. It comes out at the very top. And one of the things you'll immediately notice is that it separates this percentage of people that had a vertical wall. So on one side, if neighbors had a vertical wall, there was a 91% chance that the homeowner who took the survey would also have a vertical wall. As opposed to if none of their neighbors had a vertical wall, then there was only a 19% chance. So this is the story we've talked about the most with this, is that this is a neighboring effect. Homeowners are influenced by what's going on the other sides of them. And this is really important for understanding the drive. Now, we know there's a couple of potential explanations for this. One is socially. One person sees another person change their shoreline and they like what they see. So they ask, hey, who did this? Can you help me get contact? And that tends to be a social mechanism. But another is more physical, that when a bulkhead is put in place, we know that it speeds up erosion. So it triggers the homeowners beside them to do something. So it's really a mix of both of these things. But we knew also that this latter part, the fact that there was this legacy effect of what neighbors did, was going to be influential, and we anticipated that. So we also asked in the survey, if you were able to do it all over again, what would you choose today if you had a natural shoreline that was experiencing erosion? So this was kind of our buyer's remorse question to see what people would choose. And so all of these arrows between the circles tell you what people told us in response to that question. So of our survey respondents, 72% had a vertical wall. When you ask them what they would do over again, 76% would choose the same thing. So that tells you they're generally satisfied. Only 5% would choose a natural shoreline to retain it. So that's really alarming from a habitat conservation standpoint. Even more alarming is if you look at the people who had the natural shorelines, only 41%, if they had to consider erosion, would try to retain their natural shoreline. The bulk of them were going towards some other type of hardening approach. So we did the same thing. Oh, it's freezing on me. The slide's not advancing.
Do you want to try to stop sharing and share again?
Let's try that. Sorry about that, y'all. I don't know what that was. Okay, let's try this again. You know what? I will just skip that slide. Actually, I'll leave it right here so you can see. Can everyone see this? Can you see this okay?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay, so the big takeaway point there is that when you ask them this hypothetical scenario of what they would do, they essentially have the same scenario. So they're choosing, the artificial shoreline types. And again, when we do this predictive modeling, essentially the same story sticks, to where individuals with neighbors that have hardened shorelines still are highly likely to choose hardened alternatives, as opposed to those, if they don't really have those bulkheads beside them, they're less likely to choose a bulkhead and more likely to be conducive towards a living shoreline. So I'm going to try to go back to the slideshow here, if it'll function. But the simple takeaway of this is, we ultimately, if we're thinking about the homeowners with these bulkheads and trying to get them to consider a living shoreline, we have a couple of different attitudes that were prevailing from our comments and from our survey feedback. One of them is the homeowners that were more interested in alternatives. And they typically said things like, I would gladly use different methods if they were available and costs were reasonable. But we still had a small percentage that would say things like, I'll fight any regulation on how I must stabilize my property. It's private property, and I should be able to make decisions the way I want to. And so that was not a common perspective, but it was a perspective that we saw. And so both of those are important, but it only takes a few of the attitude on the right to drive the system, considering the strong neighboring effect. So what we say that this tells us for our research and the way we approach it is that we really need two things. One, we need living shorelines alternatives that are cost effective and durable, which is the technological fix. And that comes from engineers and landscape architects and ecologists and those folks. But we also need to understand the drivers of social change. And so that's typically the space where social scientists like us are working. So we used that study to inform a follow-up. And this is one that we collaborated with a lot of different groups. In particular, the Nature Conservancy was really involved in this. And we did a follow-up study, same system, same residents, but about 4 years later, where we focused on trying to understand incentives for nature-based strategies like living shorelines. We did our survey a little bit differently, and I'll just briefly mention some of the methods. So the last survey, we delivered to people in a printed survey, and they mailed it back to us. And so that survey was printed all the way through and kind of set up. This second survey here, we did online, to where we mailed letters and postcards like the one you see, and asked people to take an online survey. And we were able to do a few more interactive things based on our online survey that you'll see emerge as part of the story. I will just mention on this one, this is one we get asked about the most because it specifically focuses on cost shares for living shorelines. And so we do have a paper on this. If anyone's interested in it, I'm happy to share it afterwards. But it was really focused on designing incentives. And I also wanted to show this just to point out kind of the diversity in our project team in terms of like expertise. So I have a couple of folks from the Nature Conservancy, Judy Hayner and Mike Beck. Brett Webb is a coastal engineer. Grabowski is an ecologist. Craig Landry and Andy Keeler are economists. And then some of my graduate students who I'll introduce later in some slides. But essentially our team was spanning the disciplines that we felt were necessary to even design this socio survey. And so the core, really the single question that I want to focus this part on was, how likely would you be to replace your bulkhead with a living shoreline if it was damaged by a storm? And I'll just say at this point in time, that was the most common scenario that practitioners were considering. There weren't a lot of practitioners that were optimistic that people would just willingly get rid of their bulkhead for an alternative. So there was more focus on the rebuild after storm context. That's also really relevant for us down in a southeast region that's heavily and frequently impacted by storms. So everything going okay with the screen sharing? I could just see some chat.
Yep, everything looks good.
Okay, good. So when we ask this question, the prevailing story here is not very likely. So 58% said not likely to go back with a living shoreline. Only 18% actually said likely, to where we had about a quarter in the middle that were undecided. But this is something that we anticipated. And this is part of the reason that we went with an online survey this time, because homeowners only saw one question at a time. And so they answered this question, they gave us the answer. And then we did something to where we tried to do a little experiment with them. But first, I'll just explain a little bit more of what what these differences were driven by. So if you partition this out, essentially we said 18% were likely. So we asked this likelihood on a very unlikely, which is your 1, to a very likely, which is your 5 here. The middle 24% is the 3. And so we used the same type of tree analysis to partition it here, but we took a little bit more of a sociological approach and asked people some other questions. So one of them that turned out to be very important was if people felt like natural shorelines were important for their community's identity, if they felt like it was something that was just important to the way that they experience nature, then they were about twice as likely, almost 3 times as likely for some categories to be more supportive or more likely for living shorelines. And then as you get up into homeowners who were more concerned with erosion, which is the bottom right, then they were about 25%. So you start to creep up into higher levels of likelihood. But again, I don't want to misconstrue this. Most folks were not supportive of living shorelines, or unlikely at least to implement it from the start. And so that's essentially what our data showed us. So we had designed a study that was based upon behavioral economics with our economics collaborators to optimize the use of incentives. And so after homeowners told us this initial response, then we followed up with a question that was randomized, and it said, okay, but what if a local nonprofit was willing to pay X% of your living shoreline? And that percent was randomized between 10% intervals from 10% to 90%. And so basically a homeowner would say this, and so they would say very unlikely. And then you say, well, what if a local nonprofit was willing to pay 50%? Then they might say something different, or they might say the same thing. And that's effectively what we were interested in testing to see if a cost share could have an effect. And it turns out that it did. It shifted most of the respondents towards the right, becoming more likely. Most of them became more likely to consider a living shoreline. The unlikely group decreased from 58% to 40%, and the likely increased from 18 to 30. The middle group grew a little bit too. So you had some folks that were unlikely that then became undecided. What's really interesting here that I'm not going to show, but I will just mention that we talk about in the paper a little bit, is the question we always get is how much should be given, how much cost share was most effective. And it turned out that the dollar value didn't matter. It was insignificant. It was almost consistent in terms of that it had the same effect whether you offered 20% or 80%. And so this doesn't make economics sense. So we went back and did some follow-up interviews on this. And what most folks told us was that it wasn't the actual money. These are $30,000 to $50,000 decisions in most of our study systems on houses that are worth a couple $1 million. So these were not necessarily economics decisions as much as they were other complex things that were coming into it. And knowing that a local environmental group was willing to partner and be there for technical assistance or be there to provide advice was really what was driving the increase. So it was more of a social incentive as much as it was an economic incentive. And so a couple of questions that come up a lot. So a few things that I mentioned I would come back to earlier on. One is, how unique is Alabama? So all these surveys were done in Alabama. Is Alabama similar to anywhere else? So a couple of comments on that. So first, in terms of the neighbors affecting neighbors, and then the general trends of shoreline preferences, we've now done these surveys extensively in Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, Massachusetts. And it's almost the exact same story everywhere. So homeowners prefer bulkheads, even more so if their neighbors have them. And it's this neighboring effect is the most strong predictor in almost every system. But we were still really wanting to look at this in an area that was drastically different. And so I'll just show you one result to make a comparison here to the Florida Keys, which is another system we worked in. I will just make a side note that some of the motivation to working in the Keys was living 10 years in Boston and needing a place to get out of the cold to go and work. So we thought the Keys would be an ideal system for that. But there's a lot of other kind of characteristics that made it perfectly set up to compare to our Alabama work. And one is that the shorelines are extremely regulated. So there's a lot of policy, all the way from local policies and land ordinances to property owners associations to state policies that restrict, particularly like the trimming of mangroves, to unique federal policies like National Marine Sanctuary Act that don't apply to places like Alabama because they're not in a marine sanctuary. But all of these have a very, very strong influence on homeowners, protecting the natural habitats, making it harder to do the hardening or armoring strategies. And so we essentially did part of the same survey there. And I just want to remind you what these trends look like in Alabama, but to basically show you that most folks in the system had the artificial shorelines and preferred those. And so when we did this in the Keys, We asked the similar questions and analyzed them almost the same way. Couple of differences. We didn't really have riprap, which is the bottom right in purple in the Keys. We had more of a hybrid scenario of really altered mangroves. So we separated there to natural mangroves versus natural marsh. And then, and you can start to see these trends. So if you look at the green, you can see 14% had natural mangroves, 14% had marsh, 19% had marsh in Alabama, 40-something% would have stayed the same. Jump down to the bulkheads, 68% had these in the Keys, 72% had them in Alabama, and high levels of kind of preference for those. So totally blew our mind how similar these patterns were when you had drastically different regulatory environments. To me, my interpretation of this is it tells you, one, policies can change. So it doesn't necessarily mean all the policies were as restrictive back in time when many of these structures were put in. But it also tells you that the social process and the social influence is really important, because homeowners have a lot of latitude even amongst the policy landscape and make a lot of these decisions on their own. So I'm going to use that to transition a little bit into what we're working on now. So we've continued to see how those types of studies apply to other areas, but we've also reached a point to where we know we're still trying to understand homeowners and trying to understand what might facilitate or find some level of incentive for living shorelines. And sometimes it's our weakness as researchers to try to oversimplify complex scenarios. So these are things that are complicated. They're not simple. And so we've been using a research approach called collaborative modeling, to where we build models with residents. And sometimes this looks like a really messy drawing like you see here, to where you come in and ask about a specific scenario and say, how did Hurricane Irma affect the mangroves? And in this case, they perceived them to affect them negatively. Or you may ask how they affected trees. And you build these ultimate models here that we can then take and do a lot of things. But one of the things we can do is we can run what if scenarios of management and say, okay, so it's not a single question. It's a big, complicated system. What if we change something in the system? What happens next? And so this is one approach that we've really been focused on going forward. We typically do these in interviews like the picture you see on the left, or in workshops. And we've got a lot of work that's recently been coming out on this. The one I'll just highlight here, if you're really interested in it, was focused on Hurricane Irma in the Keys and how residents perceived all these changes. Kelsey Furman was a PhD student in my lab who now works for the Smithsonian. But this is a good example of that. But essentially, it lets you take these drawings and turn them into models, and then make predictions about what people might do or how a system might change through time. We're also, another thing just to kind of wrap up here, we're also really now leaning into a phase of trying to connect our work to ongoing action and practice. And so, as I'm sure a lot of y'all are aware, there's a lot of new investment in infrastructure, and much of that is on nature-based infrastructure. And so we've been really fortunate to collaborate with groups down in the Gulf that are doing this like on the ground implementation and planning. Alabama's actually been very, very fortunate. There's going to be quite a lot of planning and implementation for living shorelines occurring over the next several years. And so we're going to get to do our survey research and stakeholder engagement and directly tie it into cost shares and tie it into on the ground implementation, to try to continue doing research, understand what works, what doesn't work, what's meeting the expectations of homeowners, what isn't, and how this kind of science and practice can be co-produced. And also want to just be very, very clear that there's a lot of people working on this type of stuff in the Gulf in particular. Just getting back down here a year ago, I'm still, still growing to appreciate how many folks and how much progress has been made. One group that I think is really relevant for this audience that y'all might be interested in or considering reaching out to is Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant. Eric Sparks, who runs the coastal program there, and then part of his staff, including Sarah Martin, who you can see wrote this blog, has been running a cost share program that essentially involves providing technical expertise to homeowners and helping them, acquire designs or get through the process towards a living shoreline if that's something that they choose to do along their shoreline. And I think it's been very successful. And we're working with them on all the new infrastructure projects. So I think collaboration is really key. But I wanted to just, my last slide here is just, after 15 years or so of doing these social science studies, mention what I think are our three kind of big takeaways at this point in time. Before I do that, though, as you're kind of looking at them, I'll mention this picture on the left, because it ultimately, all of our work comes down into trying to understand pictures like the left. So this one here shows a waterfront resident on one of the bays off the eastern shore of Mobile Bay. And he's explaining to one of my former students, Lauren, that he really does not want a bulkhead. He has a natural marsh shoreline. He doesn't want a bulkhead because he appreciates water quality, and that's his blue crab trap that's between them. And he knows that there's consequences of that. He really wants the water quality to stay well enough that his grandkids can go down that ladder and swim. But he also recognizes that he had a line drawn on the back of the door of his garage that showed where the Hurricane Katrina water level was. And he's not ideally, hoping to encounter that type of scenario again. But he also worries about ship traffic. And so this is one of his friends that's a shrimper going up the bay that's going to put a wake off the bulkhead on the other side and onto his side. So recognizing all these various complex influences and trade-offs is something that's really, really difficult to do, but important. And so for understanding how shorelines are developed, where there's a lot of residential development, understanding that homeowner perspective is essential. It also has major influences for beyond the waterfront. In many areas, especially the types of places that I'm accustomed to working, there's often a major wealth difference between the waterfront and one block inland. So you have individuals who are able to shape the ecology and the function of a system that other people rely on the public access sites or kayak sites, and their water quality and their fishing access may be influenced by the decisions of a small group of stakeholders. And so that's important for, thinking about environmental justice. All of these things are complex, interacting individual attitudes to social norms, and we need more social science to do that. What we do know already, though, is that in many instances, these homeowners are the experts. They've lived on the water for decades. In our system in Alabama, it's about 30 years on average. And so it's very oftentimes unsuccessful to take knowledge to them of science that they already know. So it's really more trying to understand their attitudes and their values and their preferences, because many times they do have the information. They understand the system very well. It's not always the case. But I think moving beyond just an information deficit and recognizing that we're all co-producers of knowledge and that it can be more of a collaborative system, I think has a lot of promise and need in coastal restoration and outreach. And so that's all I have. We've had a lot of different entities involved as collaborators and funding. And so I don't list names because I will miss way too many people, but I'll just say thanks to all of our collaborators and students and partners in this work. Most of what I showed you today was funded by these four groups on the bottom, but I know we're holding questions to the end, so I will pass back to Camille and say thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was great. I think it's really interesting to see that your study has carried over to multiple locations, and I'm biased as a social scientist, but I always think social science is really interesting, and I know I struggle sometimes with folks already knowing the information and kind of how do we close some of the gaps in technical assistance and other things that might be helpful for folks looking to transition to living shorelines. I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Allison. We'll be talking about a really interesting program in Vermont that they have, the Vermont Lake Wise program. So Allison Marchione am I pronouncing your last name right?
It's Marchione.
Marchione, okay. Allison Marchione is the Vermont DEC Lakes and Ponds Program Lake Shoreland Coordinator. She is a Vermont native, having grown up in Brookfield and Central Vermont. She has her bachelor's in environmental science from Wells College on the shores of Cayuga Lake in Central New York, and her master's of environmental science and land management from Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, where she worked on coastal shoreline and habitat restoration. Allison lives in Heartland, Vermont, where she is an avid gardener, baker, book lover, and traveler. Thank you so much, Allison, and I will let you take it away.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yep, it looks great.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you for that great introduction, Camille. My name is Allison Marciani, and I am the Lake Shoreland Coordinator with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And I run the Vermont Lake Wise program, which aims to change people's minds and behaviors about shoreline management throughout the state. Um, so Oh, we're not advancing. Oh, there we go. So what is the Lakewise program? So the goal of the program is to establish a culture of lakeshore living that is proven to protect the lake through stormwater management best practices. Lakewise is an initiative of the Agency of Natural Resources, and it's a program that awards shoreline properties that have lake-friendly management practices. Properties that are eligible for participation in this program include state parks, town beaches, private homes, businesses, really any piece of property that has lake frontage on any of the lakes in Vermont. So Vermont, why are we concerned about using best management practices on lake shores? Well, 13% of Vermonters live within 250 feet of a lake shore. Compared with our more densely populated urban areas, such as they are, the population density is much more residences per square mile than anywhere else in our state. Shoreline alteration is a high indicator of biodiversity distress, more so than eutrophication or acidification in Northeast lakes. And we know that our shorelines are heavily developed. Since the passing of the Shoreline Protection Act in 2014, Vermont is in a period of shoreland restoration. So there's plenty of work for all of us to be doing. And I will just say, prior to 2014, there was basically almost no regulation of development on Vermont's shorelines. So one of the main goals of the Lakewise program is to reestablish living shorelines on Vermont's lake shores. Living shorelines provide multiple benefits to all. However, as much as people value, wildlife habitat and clean water, they tend to remove the native vegetation that's along their shoreline, or they have in the past, which is the most important component of the shoreline for wildlife and water quality and for property protection. So prior to 2014 and the passing of the Shoreline Protection Act, this is what most development along the lake shores in Vermont looked like. The National Lake Assessment Study has shown that Vermont ranks the worst in the nation for lakeshore disturbance because of the extensive shoreland clearing that happened prior to 2014 and the Shoreline Protection Act. A lot of Vermont lakes were developed heavily prior to 2014. And so a lot of the development looked just like these photos. The development is very close to the water. There's very little shore between dwellings and the water. Very little vegetation was left usually between houses. It was mostly lawn to lake. And there's some pretty poor stormwater practices in a lot of these properties that were developed prior to 2014. So that's where the Lakewise program comes in. I will say there's a lot better regulation currently. So any new development is kind of covered already under our Shoreline Protection Act and permitting protocols. And so the Lakewise program focuses really on those properties that were developed prior to the act being passed. So what is Lakewise? Well, Lakewise is a free stormwater management and erosion assessment program that offers technical assistance and can pair landowners with available funding resources to make stormwater improvements to their properties. And Lakewise aims to inform, teach, and encourage change in current lakeshore development practices to ones that are more lake friendly. So how does it work? Well, it's based on social science. As we all just learned, people are really influenced by what their neighbors are up to. And I've seen that again and again in my own work and many studies that have shown that. And it was nice to see that reflected also in Stephen's work. So what we do is we go to properties that already have these lake-friendly practices, and we give those properties an award as a model property. That award certifies that properties are well managed, they're using shoreline best management practices, and that they're maintained in a way that cares for the lake. The award is a sign, it's about that big, and it's displayed on the property. I like to tell people to put it on the water side. Some people like to put it on, their mailbox. Some people do it on both. I'll give you two signs. And that award certifies that that property is well managed. And so they're displaying the signs as a way to inspire their neighbors and others on the same lake to make improvements and changes so that they can also earn the award. And then cumulatively, hopefully, everyone working together increases the health of the lake through individual actions. We also do have a Gold Lake Wise Award, which is an award for lake associations when 15% of the properties on any given lake have earned the Lake Wise Award. So there is some serious competition going on. So why do we care so much about stormwater? This is a little bit of an aside from talking about the program, but I get asked by people all the time, you know, why do I care about water going into the lake? It's water, it goes into the water. What's the big deal? Well, the way that stormwater moves across the landscape can influence how much sediment is deposited into the lake. And sedimentation can cause a lot of problems for water quality, including increased phosphorus, because there's phosphorus bonded with that sediment. So phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in water systems, and aquatic plant life needs it to grow. So when you allow water to move over land and pick up sediments that are bonded with phosphorus and allow those sediments to reach the water, you're adding a dangerous input that can throw the lake system out of balance. Too much phosphorus can lead to too much plant life, including algae and toxic blue-green algae, large algal blooms, and eventually that can lead to eutrophication, which is the lack of dissolved oxygen in the water. So what we're trying to do is to slow down the stormwater before it can cause erosion and then stop sediments from actually reaching the lake by slowing and filtering the stormwater. So the program, this is our Lake Wise Award, and the Lake Wise program evaluates properties in 4 different categories. We look at driveways, structures and septic, recreation areas, and shoreline. And this is a person who would come to a private property and go through an assessment form for each one of these areas. We can also do assessments on undeveloped land. It's a different assessment form, but we mostly are working on developed properties. Participants are then provided with technical assistance in the form of a report that guides them through how to make their properties as lake friendly as possible. Assessments and technical assistance are free and they are voluntary. So this is a service provided by the state, and they're completely free and there's no regulatory aspect. So I'm not going to people's properties and saying you've violated the Shoreline Protection Act, or you absolutely have to, you know, tear down this seawall that you have, or anything like that. I make suggestions, and I explain why those suggestions are good ideas. And then if a property passes all 4 of these categories in the assessment, they're given the Lake Wise Award. This next slide is only applicable if you live in Vermont, which probably many of you do not, but basically you contact me to get an assessment. We do the assessment on site. It takes about an hour and a half. The Lake Wise report comes with detailed recommendations for improvement, and if you make changes, you can get reassessed and you win an award. This just discusses really briefly our Lake Wise Gold Award, which, like I said, when 15% of properties on a lake have earned the Lake Wise Award, that lake then becomes a Lake Wise Gold Lake. And so far, since 2014, only 3 lakes have achieved this in Vermont, but some are very, very close. And as I said, there's some very heated competition. And the program, I also want to say, also relies pretty heavily on lake association participation. Many lakes in Vermont have what we call a Lake Wise champion, where there's a person on the lake association or even a committee of the lake association that will kind of coordinate and organize, cajole, nag people into getting Lake Wise assessments. So the next part of my presentation is actually talking about some of the best management practices that are common and commonly suggested through the Lake Wise assessments. And hopefully this is interesting information for any of you who might be living on lakes, or even if you don't live on lakes. These are all kind of good stormwater management techniques. So the assessment looks first at roads and driveways. As you'll see in the picture, this is a driveway with some somewhat severe erosion. These rivulets are forming, going down a somewhat steep driveway. And as you can imagine, probably towards the lake. So one of the things that we suggest to stop driveway erosion is open top culverts. These culverts are able to sort of interrupt the flow of the water and direct it into another area instead of straight down the driveway. So in this particular case, it's going into a rock-lined catchment basin. Other times it might flow into a vegetated area, a flower bed, a rain garden, something like that. We also often are suggesting vegetated edges around parking areas. So, you're not using this area around the parking area. You can add vegetation to stop and slow stormwater, and also delineating a parking area so that you're not compacting soil all over the place. You have like one designated place to park your car. Vegetated swales are another great way to catch water. So as it's coming off of these parking areas or off of the road, it's flowing into this depression in the land that has vegetation and mulch in it to absorb and slow down any stormwater. Rain gardens are also a great way of absorbing water in many different instances. So in this particular one, runoff was coming off of the road and down a really steep bank into the yard here, which was very close to the lake's edge. And installing this rain garden right along the edge of the road was able to catch all of that runoff that was coming off the road and kind of sequester it in the rain garden instead of running over the lawn. Rock-lined ditches, always a great idea. In Vermont, most of the roads around our lakes are private roads. And so they are maintained in various different conditions, but especially any place where there is a slope to those roads, a rock-lined ditch is a good way to catch and slow stormwater. You're going to hear me say catch and slow and filter stormwater about 1 million times, because that's the point of the whole program. So next, septic and structures. We talk a lot about septic and structures, looking at where stormwater is going once it hits the roof of the home, as well as talking about sort of best management practices for managing septic systems. I will say, if anyone has questions about septics, I'm not a septic expert. And in Vermont, the regulation of septics is in a completely different department. But we do have some questions on our assessment form about how septic systems are managed, because we do know that a lot of septic systems around lake shores are older and maybe not quite failing, but certainly older, and that a lot of the lots around lakes are incredibly small. So replacing septic systems is a really hot button topic. So again, rain gardens are a great way to divert water from the roof or from a gutter system through a downspout, and then kind of collect that water in a rain garden where it can be filtered into the ground instead of running over the land. We are often suggesting, downspout disconnection or downspouts, going into dry wells or something like that, as well as infiltration trenches around homes. So infiltration trenches basically are just dug out and filled with various sizes of stone to catch and slow and filter rainwater. Rain barrels are also a great option for anyone who has a purpose for them. I don't like to tell everyone across the board that they should have a rain barrel, because if you don't have a reason to use that water, you're going to end up just breeding mosquitoes or something like that. But for watering plants and gardens, it can be a really great source of sort of extra water at your home. The next area that we look at is recreation areas. This generally is referring to the lawn area around a house. And I am always saying lawns are basically the enemy. Grass has very shallow roots. It does not absorb water. Water flows right over the top of it. And grass is not, for the purposes of the Lake Wise assessment, considered vegetation. So we're really focused on minimizing erosion and increasing vegetation and the duff layer in this section. So I'm never telling people to get rid of their entire lawns, but really asking them to take a critical look at what they're actually using, and sort of seeing if there are some areas that could be revegetated or rewilded or something like that, because a lot of people aren't actually using all of that grassy lawn space. So this is the rain garden. As I said, they're great in all sorts of situations. And rain gardens can be incredibly attractive. They can be full of flowering perennial plants. I always like to suggest natives, and there are a lot of beautiful flowering native perennials and native shrubs that can go in rain gardens or along shorelines, and can be very attractive, sort of look like landscaping. This is one example of a rain garden that I think looks just like a lovely perennial bed, and you'd never even know that it was a stormwater feature. This is a woman who put in a lot of plantings in front of her house and parking area in order to sort of revegetate. And you can see how compacted the soil looks in the before photo, and it was a lot healthier after being amended. One of my favorite things to suggest to people, and the easiest possible thing to do, is to create no-mow areas along shorelines. And this is, again, for areas of lawns that aren't being used, turning them into sort of a meadow areas, maybe mowing them once a year. It creates great habitat for pollinators and birds and small mammals, and can be extremely attractive. Vermont has some really pretty native wildflowers. And I hate mowing my lawn. I don't understand why people want to do it so very much. So I suggest creating no mow areas. It's easy, it's cheap, it's very effective. We are always asking people to delineate their pathways down towards the lake shore, especially when they're going down slopes. And the top before picture, you can see people were just kind of walking all over the place. Nothing was growing, and you can just see the bare dirt and how it would wash out when it rained. So in the after picture, these lovely pathways had been delineated. Plantings had been put in around those pathways to discourage people from walking outside of the pathways. The pathways and the steps are both infiltration, so that water can seep down through them and get filtered. And we do always suggest a meandering path instead of one that goes straight down to the water, because a straight path down to the water, especially over bare ground, is just asking for erosion issues. Like I said, infiltration steps, we are always suggesting those on sloping pathways. They work by catching and infiltrating water down into the ground, and we're always suggesting these sort of plantings around them to keep people on the steps and to encourage more vegetated growth areas. Sometimes I also recommend infiltration steps with sort of crib walls on the sides if it's a really steep slope, and then those can be planted as well. And it looks really pretty and attractive. I mean, I think the after picture is a lot more appealing than the before picture. This is just another example of sort of the same thing with the infiltration steps and the plantings around it. Again, I think it looks really nice and attractive and has the added benefit of curtailing all of that erosion. The final section of the Lake Wise assessment is the shoreline, and we are very heavily focused on a vegetated shoreline, as I said earlier, in order to reduce erosion and runoff, and also help to stabilize shorelines against wave action and ice push. So we're really looking for how much vegetation there is along the shore, how wide that buffer is, and what kinds of plants are in there. And there are various different, scenarios. There are some lakes that have much steeper banks, some that seem much more wave action or more ice or more wind than others. So it's always varied across the state. So obviously native plantings are one of the big things that we're recommending. Native shrubs, perennials, trees. Really, so many of the properties that we visit are devegetated to an extreme amount that sort of getting any plantings in there is great, getting people to do that. This is an example of a beach area that had a failing wall. You can see this little wall here, and there's a failed area behind it where the bank was just eroding. And it was replaced, instead of being replaced with another wall, it was replaced with this native vegetation garden that is able to catch stormwater before it hits the sand, and we don't want the sand washing into the lake. So that worked out really well. You can also actually, if someone really didn't want to do vegetation here, you could also put in an infiltration trench or something of that kind, that would just be sort of a stone lined area back here that would do the same thing of catching the stormwater before it hits the sand. I've actually seen several town beaches do something along those lines. They don't want to maintain a flower bed, but they will put in an infiltration trench. So because this is a voluntary program, we take what we can get. So that's an improvement. This is an example of someone who just decided to let their shoreline go, and it was coming back in and growing in around in front of the house and over to the side, and looking great. And like I said, again, the easiest thing to do is nothing. So this is another shoreline no mow area with some beautiful wildflowers in it. And so really the goal, is to show people that they can still have access, a view, a dock, seating, and they can do that sort of within nature instead of kind of trying to fight nature all the time, and clear an area that they're not using and have these large lawns down to the lake. There are also problems that can't be solved with vegetation. I'm always talking about vegetation and rewilding shorelines and stuff like that, but there are situations where erosion has gone on for so long or is so bad that what you really need is a bioengineered shoreline. And so on these bottom three pictures, you can see a before, during, and after of a road. This is a road right along a lake shore that was being severely undercut, probably by waves. And it was basically going to dump that road into the lake. And so we did this bioengineering project. These are encapsulated soil lifts. So within this, it looks like burlap, but it's actually coconut fiber. Within that, there's a bunch of soil, and then there's a coconut fiber roll at the end to kind of stabilize and hold everything together. And then plants were planted into that, like into the coconut fiber, into the soil, to stabilize the shoreline. And so we really built that shoreline back out. And this photo is from 2020, but I can confirm that this vegetation is still there and still doing its job and holding that shoreline together. And so this is a really great example of one way to do a bioengineering project on an undercut and eroding shoreline. The top picture here is of, I think it's live staking of a bank that had to be, I believe it was regraded and then live staked. And I think there's a coconut fiber matting underneath here. And so those are probably willow stakes that are being used to stabilize the shoreline. And you literally, you can take like a piece of willow and stick it in the ground and it'll grow, and it grows really great deep roots that hold in the soil and stabilize the shoreline. So yeah, vegetation is still, even in these bioengineering projects, vegetation is great. It's Mother Nature's way of holding that soil down. And so, we're starting from this point in prior to 2014, where our shorelines are cleared, our lawns are enormous, our houses are very close to the lake. We can't really solve that problem. And we're trying to move, I would say we're moving towards this right now, where people are letting their edges grow in and soften and rewild. And we're really trying to get to here, where we're really only using the space that we need. Our shorelines are vegetated. Our lake inhabitants are happy. They're cooler because of the shade that vegetation provides and some of the food that gets dropped in there. We're surrounded by birds and pollinators and our natural wildlife, which is the reason we all want to go to the lake anyway. So that's the goal. And here are some happy people receiving their Lake Wise awards and being thrilled about it. And that's all that I have for you folks today. So thank you for letting me come and talk to you about our Vermont Lake Wise program.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was amazing. I think it's great, especially since Vermont is our neighbor and has so many similarities. I think it's great to learn all about the Lake Wise program. I think it's amazing, and I'd love to see a similar program here in New York State, especially in the Finger Lakes. I saw a bunch of questions coming in. Let me see if I can pull up the Q&A. One person is asking, does change happen easier after algae blooms? So I think maybe if you get more interest in the Lake Wise program, or to come out after an algae bloom.
I think people get really alarmed after algae blooms, especially if they are not used to them. So if they're on a lake that does not usually have them and they start seeing them, people do get really into water quality really fast when they can't use the water because there's algae blooms. So yes, it is sometimes hard to draw the line between like the way people are managing their shoreline and algae. But my whole job is talking to people, so I just keep doing it.
That's great. I see Stephen answered some questions already too. That's amazing. Let's see. Frank asked, have you seen an uptick in service providers with the creation of this program? Are most Lake-wise improvements do it yourself or provided by ecologically knowledgeable professionals?
That's a great question. The Lake Wise program was originally designed so that homeowners could do a lot of these projects. That's why some of the things we suggest are like no-mow areas, or planting some bushes, or maybe install an infiltration trench around your house. You could do that yourself. But Vermont, at least, has a lot of clean water funding right now. And so there is a lot of opportunity for grants. And so the way things have been moving is sort of away from individual homeowners completing entire projects on their own. And there's a lot more support from the state to do even some of these smaller projects like buffer plantings.
That's great. Yeah, I know in New York, we're getting kind of an influx of funding from some of the Infrastructure Act funding, but also the state passed like an environmental bond act. So a lot of that is going to be focused on water quality. I think what we struggle with is a lot of it goes to like municipalities or public land and doesn't always get to private homeowners. So I don't know if Vermont has kind of found a way to address that or if the state is just putting funding towards private residences.
Mhm.
Let's see. I saw another question here. Chris is asking, Stephen and Allison, thank you. Love the driveway road mitigations. We have very steep slopes in Skinny Atlas. Can you offer any examples of municipalities influencing hardened shore owners to revert to natural shorelines? In Skinny Atlas, we could encourage permanent docks using the DEC approved small diameter piles rather than bulkheads for new construction and replacement. So I guess, can you offer any examples of municipalities that have influenced hardened shore owners to kind of revert to natural shorelines?
I can't.
Yeah, that was kind of my comment back as well. I can't immediately think of anything that was directly municipality level driven. Like everything that I'm most familiar with has been driven by a state agency or a nonprofit or something like that. I know there's some programs out there that incentivize municipalities to take action. I don't know how exclusively focused on coastal systems these are, like FEMA's community ratings system for flood control can create some incentives for municipalities to, and then incentivize landowners to take specific actions on their property. But I have to do a little bit more digging on that one. I'm happy to look if I need to think about it.
Yeah, that's
I have
okay.
a question for Allison, if I could. So,
Yeah.
how much success or experience have y'all had with getting a group of homeowners to go in together? Like, is it patchy, or do you get like 5 in a row that come in and say, we want to do something together and we all want to go for this? That seems to be a missing piece for us in our coastal systems, is we still always have a few scattered people who don't want it for one reason or the other, and private property kind of rights still make that quite challenging.
Yeah, we've seen it both ways. So we have definitely seen several landowners want to, revegetate together. We also, the way, I don't know how it is on the coast, but we'll get several homes in a row that are owned by the same family, different generations. And so, yeah, we definitely see that happen. But we have also seen it happen where someone in the middle is like, I want nothing to do with this program. Usually it's, I want nothing to do with the state being on my land. So, people go both ways. I think like I said in the presentation, having the lake associations sort of on board to kind of talk to people, pressure people a little bit, does also help, when it's the neighbors kind of trying to talk to the neighbors versus the state trying to talk to the neighbors.
That's great. Yeah. Our lake association is amazing in Skaneateles, and every Finger Lake has amazing lake associations that have done a lot of similar efforts to promoting stormwater management and all of that. But I think it would be great to have like a formalized program. I actually want to highlight Olivia's question. That Stephen already answered, but I thought it might be good to mention again. She said, has this work been extended to lake shorelines, specifically Stephen's research, or would there be any reason to think results would be different in a lakeshore settings? I don't know, Stephen, if you want to just like briefly comment on that or kind of summarize what we wrote.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things I pointed out is that when I talk about the environmental impacts of bulkheads and shoreline hardening, a lot of that really early work was done in lakes. And it shows that when you put like the bulkheads in place, there's not as much like coarse woody debris and fish habitat around, which is really important for fish. So should have mentioned that lakes were some of the origins of that work. I have seen a few surveys, and there's more probably similarities than differences, with a big caveat that I didn't mention about just how much geographic variability and differences there are even amongst like coasts. So in the Northeast, when I was up there, there's enormous tides, and we really don't have tides that are of a measurable effect in the Northern Gulf. So if you live on a lake system and you're dealing with how the lake may manage the water level, and some seasons it's up and some it's down, that's something we hear a lot from people on lakes or rivers. That's the same in some coastal systems. It just may not be the same as Alabama. So there's a lot of variability there. I think cost effectiveness and durability still probably shake out the top of the surveys in all places, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Question then.
Oh, I have a comment about that too. We have seen some people, when their walls fail, they might replace them with a bioengineered situation or a vegetated shoreline, but nobody wants to tear down their working wall and replace it. So we really try to get in there when we're like, oh, it looks like you've got maybe 2 years left and then you're going to have to take this out. That's the sweet spot for talking to people about doing something different. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because when everybody has a hardened shoreline, it's really hard to convince people that even if they put in vegetation, that it's going to do anything because of the wave action from the coming off the other people's walls. So luckily we don't have too many lakes that are all hardened shorelines, just a few.
That's really interesting. I'm curious. I know, so we've had some pretty heavy precipitation events in Skaneateles watershed recently, and kind of why we're doing this whole series is because there's kind of been an uptick in people who had a lot of damage in those storms and are like, I need to put in some type of wall or, sheet piling. So Allison, do you see like an increased interest in the program after like heavy precipitation events in Vermont too?
I don't think I could say that there's been anything statistically significant. But I do see a lot of people who there was some flooding in 2011 and they're still talking about it. They're like, we're afraid of the flooding. That was on Lake Champlain specifically. But yeah, not necessarily rain events. There's also, it's a little harder now, I think, in Vermont to harden your shoreline because of the Shoreline Protection Act. So people, if they don't already have a hardened shoreline, it's a little bit more difficult to implement that now.
Gotcha.
So one thing we've seen in Alabama and in some of the other coastal settings is those types of questions is when it's really important to consider that all armoring might not perform the same, that some has strengths versus others. The bulkheads, the vertical walls are the ones that tend to do really poorly when they're overtopped or when there's a lot of rain on the landward side. That's when homeowners report the highest maintenance cost. So if they have to pay for backfilled sediments and bring truckloads of dirt in, it gets very expensive very quickly. But the riprap revetments, this is an issue y'all probably don't have at your northern latitude, but something we hear a lot on the coastal areas and on lakes is that the bulkheads are good at keeping undesirable animals out of your yard, whether those be alligators or snakes. And riprap actually is quite good habitat for snakes. So we have residents, when we're trying to tell them the difference is they don't like riprap because it will hold snakes. So that's definitely, you know, some of our probably southeast biodiversity.
That's funny. We get complaints about geese and beavers.
There you go.
Yeah, I would say no, no alligators. Interesting though. Let's see. Chris said, perfect example. Allison, Skinny Atlas could intervene in repair replacement of damaged bulkhead docks to encourage reversion to a natural shoreline with a permanent dock with a small diameter piles. Thanks. I know the town of Skinny Atlas is really interested in kind of the issue of docks and maybe having some type of regulation around that, or thinking about how to deal with the dock side of shorelines. Are there any other questions? Let me see. Don't see anything. Otherwise, we will wrap this up. Thank you all so much for sticking out with us. I know it's a beautiful evening in New York tonight, so thank you for joining us. A huge thank you to our speakers for today, Stephen and Allison. Please don't forget to fill out our evaluation form. I really appreciate it, and I do actually go through it, especially at the end of every year when thinking about programs for next year. I will send out an email with the evaluation and recording link and any other resources, and I'll send it out probably within the next couple of days. Sometimes it takes us a second to get it uploaded to our YouTube channel. I hope you all will join us at our July 13th program. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Allison and Stephen.
Thank y'all.
All right, have a good night, everyone.